let's go for the next part of the talk, discussing about what is really the mental representation that we discuss about in terms of the actions and future and the role of prefrontal cortex. We discussed in the previous classes discussing about what we called representation in the brain. We discussed about how the brain is the environment, the external environment is being reflected to the brain as something like what we do with photography, and how this representation are just some codes from what is really happening outside. So that is the representation. But there is something like a 1/101 kind of representation from whatever we have outside to the map that we make in the camera, or whatever we make on the kind of the brain space that we have. In a more sophisticated way, we discussed about different levels of representation. So we discussed that we can have representations in the visual cortex, different parts of the visual cortex. We can have them in, let's say, different temporal parts. We discussed that we can have representations in hippocampus, in posterior cingulate cortex. And we discussed that these representations could have different levels of details or different levels of codings, but they are still representing whatever we had in the outside environment. So we know that the information that we had from the visual cortex would be represented in other levels as well, and these other levels are going to make our memories. They are going to make whatever we have as something like an understanding about what is happening from outside. So that is what we have been thinking about, and whatever we have been discussing about before in these parts was about past. So it was about what is happening, what has happened outside. So these are the representations that we had from before, what was happening outside. But what we have in the prefrontal cortex is an opportunity to be able to have mental representations about future. And this is what we have in terms of representing actions on the prefrontal cortex, and then developing those actions into more complex representations. To give you a better sense about what is really happening, let me just kind of start with some exercise that we are going to do together again. So please be ready. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Just use the chat space to post your answers. As we discussed about before, let's do this Tower of London exercise together. So this is 1, 2, 3. Write down your answer in terms of how you can get to from this starting point to the goal position with just 2 moves. You can say, let's say, move red to 1 or blue to 3. So whatever you are going to do, you can write it down in the chat space to see how can you do that in 2 moves. So let me show you the answer. So these are basically 2 moves. Technically moving blue to 3 and then red to 2. Now, can you do this in 4 moves? From this point to this point, and this is 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Let's go for the response. This is the response. Are you ready for the last one, which is going to be the most complex one? And we are going to be back to see who is going to give the first answer to the last one, which is going to be correct. So, okay, this is the last one. And as I told you, this is going to be 1, 2, 3. So you're going to get from here to here. Okay, good, good. Let me show you the response. Okay, so one of the organizers, one of my assistants, would go through the responses and see who has done, whoever has been. Not that that's the first one, the first 3 person that have been able to find the right response, and then he will tell you who has been the first 3 champions that they have done the task. It is really good. It is really good that you have tried to do that. Then the question is, okay, what do we mean by doing this? How do we do this specific action? So what we are doing here, as we have been discussing about before, if it is the motor cortex, this is the sensory cortex, we need to think about, okay, this is one move, I can change this to this, and change this to this, and change this to this. So whatever we are going to do is not just a simple motor cortex, it is beyond simple motor cortex. So it is about motor planning. And that is what we call, that is going to be happening in the prefrontal cortex. So it goes beyond what we have in just the primary motor cortex that we have. So that is exactly what we do in terms of mental representation of actions. Thinking about what would be the next move. Just trying to imagine what are the things that you need to do for the next steps and putting them together. As you can imagine, when you are doing this, there are different brain functions involved. You need to have a good level of attention, working memory, executive function. All those things, they need to work together to make whatever we are labeling as mental representation of action. If you want to mentally represent what you are going to do, and I'm thinking that you are doing this without, let's say, using pen and pencil. So if you are just doing this process in your mental setting without using any pen and pencil, you are just trying to represent whatever you are going to do inside your brain. Obviously, when you use a paper and pencil, you are using those additional representational maps, because whatever you are writing there is going to be another level of action representation in the paper. So we can have action representation on the paper, or we can have action representation over the prefrontal cortex. And probably the best combination is just having, both being involved to be able to make the best possible sort of plan for the future. And this is what we usually do even in our daily life, to use a piece of paper and also using our brain to do the best possible mental representation of the actions that we are going to do in the next few minutes or next few seconds. So this is exactly what we have been discussing in terms of the representation. But here is not a representation of what has happened in the past. Is about representation about what is going to happen in the future. And this is how we have what we call dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It seems that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a critical part of the prefrontal cortex in terms of representing actions that are going to happen in the future. But what about the roles of other parts? We will discuss about the role of other parts of the prefrontal cortex in this mental representation. Okay, now if we have an injury on dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, what is going to happen if I just have an injury over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? So if I go back and have an injury in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so there is no, let's say, future planning. There are many cases of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that people explored. If you give them something like a cup without even coffee inside, or give them a pencil, or give them another sort of tool, they just use that in what we call in a reactive way. To just respond to some of the stimuli without thinking that, okay, what would be the future consequence of this action? So this is what we call reactive compared to what we discussed in terms of being proactive. So they use them in a reactive way. And how? If you just give them an empty cup, they would just drink from an empty cup. They put on jacket belonging to someone else and just using a pencil over the table surface without having a specific, let's say, purpose for doing that. So they get just reactive. So they just respond to the stimuli that you give them in the environment without any purposeful sequences of actions that is going to end up to a specific goal in the future. When I'm talking about future, it might be just the next few seconds. There is no kind of sort of future in this process. They cannot proactively plan and think about, okay, if I do this, what will be the consequence of that? So there is no, let's say, consequence, or there is no future in this process that we discuss about. And we call that field-dependent behavior. So field-dependent behavior is one of the characteristics of some of the people who have dorsolateral prefrontal cortex damage. So that could be one of the representations of having a damage on that part of the brain. And you can imagine that is going to be critically detrimental in whatever is making us as us. So that is the challenge that we face in these disorders. Okay, that was the end of the part 2, discussing about mental representations and going beyond what we have discussed about mental representations, about past and what has happened before, when we discuss about, let's say, memories or visual perception or auditory perception, all the things that we discussed together before in the classes and sessions before. Today we are discussing about futuristics action representation that is going to happen in prefrontal cortex.